On a cool October night in 2001, in the coastal city of Savannah, Georgia, a quiet man's life was about to be rewritten by a lie. Sonny Bharadia, a 28-year-old computer technician, soft-spoken, kind, devoted to his family, was at home, planning a trip, dreaming of the future. But by dawn, those dreams were gone. Because that same night, miles away, a young woman was attacked in her apartment. Her world shattered. And when the police began their hunt for the man responsible, they found Sonny's stolen car near the scene. No witnesses, no DNA, no fingerprints, just a coincidence. One so small, yet powerful enough to destroy a man's life. In the fog of fear and urgency, the system made its choice. It ignored the evidence. It ignored the truth. And it turned an innocent man into a villain. By the time the trial ended, Sonny Bharadia, who had never even met the victim, was branded a monster. A man sentenced to spend his life behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. And so began his 20-year war against silence, rejection, and the machinery of injustice. While the real culprit lived freely, Sonny sat in a cell, clinging to the one weapon he had left, his faith in the truth. For 2 decades, he wrote letters, filed motions, begged the world to listen. And when no one did, he kept fighting anyway. Because somewhere deep inside, Sonny knew truth might sleep, but it never dies. And then, after 20 years, the evidence finally spoke. DNA proved what Sonny had been saying since day one. He was innocent. This is the story of a man who refused to surrender. A man who fought the impossible fight and won. Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Innocence Uncovered, where we expose the hidden truths behind wrongful convictions and give a voice to those the system tried to silence. Because this isn't just a story about one man's freedom. It's a story about the strength of the human spirit and what it means to never give up, no matter how long justice takes. This is the story of Sonny Bharadia, the man who fought for 20 years and finally proved that the truth was worth the wait. For over 20 years, Sonny Bharadia's home was a prison cell. His job was proving his innocence. But before all that, before the mugshot, before the verdict, before the silence of concrete walls, there was just a man trying to build a life. Sonny was 27 in 2001, living in Georgia. His friends called him Sonny, not just because of his name, but because of who he was. He had a warmth to him, an optimism that felt easy to be around. He was a sheet metal worker by trade, the kind of guy who could fix almost anything. Cars, appliances, air conditioning vents, it didn't matter. His hands were rough, skilled, steady. He liked solving problems, putting things back together. His co-workers say he had that quiet confidence, the sort of steadiness that made you trust him. He wasn't loud, wasn't flashy. He just showed up, did his work, and did it right. Outside of work, Sonny's life was unremarkable in the best way. He had a girlfriend, a small circle of friends, a mother who called to check if he was eating enough. Weekends often meant helping someone fix their car or catching a late movie. His world was simple, predictable, filled with little routines. He had big dreams, but nothing extraordinary. Maybe one day he'd open his own repair shop. Maybe he'd build a family. Maybe he'd save enough to bring his mother the kind of comfort she'd earned. If you'd asked him then, he would have said life was steady. Hard at times, sure, but fair enough. He believed that as long as you did right, right would come back to you. He didn't know yet that life, and the system, had other plans. In the fall of 2001, the weather in Georgia was cooling. Days were shorter. The air felt heavier. Sonny was working long hours, driving a silver Chevrolet Tahoe, proud of what he'd built with his own hands. One afternoon, his Tahoe was stolen. Just like that, gone. A police report, A shrug, a feeling of violation. It was annoying, but he moved on. He couldn't know that this stolen car, his car, would later become the thread that tied him to a crime he had nothing to do with. He also couldn't know that somewhere else in Georgia, in a small apartment near Savannah, a terrible thing was about to happen. On the night of November 18th, 2001, a woman returned home to find a stranger inside her apartment. He was wearing batting gloves. He had a knife. She fought him off, terrified, and he fled. In her panic, she called the police. They came quickly. A shaken woman, a ransacked apartment, a story that needed answers. Within hours, detectives had a sketch, a description, an idea of who they thought they were looking for. The next day, they found stolen property, and not long after, a lead. Some of the victim's belongings were discovered in the possession of a man named Sterling Flint. And nearby, Sonny's stolen Tahoe. Two separate crimes, two separate men. But as the investigation unfolded, those lines began to blur. Police questioned Flint. They asked about the Tahoe. They asked about Sonny. They pulled photos, compared faces. They showed the victim a lineup. And at first, she pointed to Flint. But then, something changed. A second lineup was made, this time without Flint. And when the victim looked again, she picked Sonny. Just like that, everything shifted. From that moment forward, Sonny Bharadia wasn't an ordinary man anymore. He was a suspect. He didn't know it yet, though. Life went on, as usual, for a while. He worked, he drove, he called his mother. Then one afternoon, police showed up. They told him he was being taken in for questioning about a burglary and an assault. He was confused, but cooperative. He thought, there must be a mistake. I'll clear this up. But the questions grew sharper. The officer's tone changed. Where were you that night? Who can vouch for you? Why do we find stolen property linked to you? Sonny tried to explain. He said his Tahoe had been stolen. He gave details, but they didn't seem to care. They already had a story, and in their story, he was the villain. When they finally said, "You're under arrest," he remembers the way his stomach dropped. He remembers thinking it had to be temporary, that he'd make bail, get a lawyer, and everything would be cleared up. He had never been in trouble with the law, never been arrested, never even imagined what handcuffs would feel like. But there he was, wrists cold and metal, sitting in the back of a police car, watching the world blur past the window. That night, in a holding cell, he tried to sleep but couldn't. He kept replaying everything in his head, his car, the lineup, the confusion. He told himself over and over, "It's fine. They'll realize I didn't do it." But as days turned to weeks, and weeks into months, the truth sank in. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for closure. When the case went to trial in 2003, Sonny was terrified but hopeful. He believed that once the jury saw there was no DNA, no fingerprints, no physical evidence, they'd see what he saw. But trials aren't always about truth. They're about persuasion. And the prosecution told a persuasive story. They painted Sonny as an intruder who had broken into a woman's home, wearing gloves, wielding a knife. They showed the jury the victim's identification. They held up circumstantial pieces of evidence, weaving them into a neat narrative. His defense lawyer tried, but he was outmatched, overworked, underprepared. He didn't challenge the lineup. He didn't push hard enough on the DNA that hadn't been tested. Sonny sat in that courtroom, heart pounding, watching the system work against him, watching faces turn cold, watching his future dissolve. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, he didn't understand at first. He heard the words, but they didn't make sense. Life without parole. He remembers looking at his mother in the gallery, her face crumpling, her hands clasped like she was trying to hold the world together. He remembers thinking, this can't be happening. But it was. That night, in a cell for the first time as a convicted man, Sonny sat on the narrow cot, staring at the concrete wall. It was cold, damp, unfeeling. He pressed his palms together, still rough from years of work, and whispered, "I didn't do this." That sentence became his prayer, his mantra, his identity. "I didn't do this." Every night, he said it again, as if the words themselves could carve a way out of the stone. But the days didn't care. The doors closed. The lights dimmed. The system moved on. Inside, he was just another number. Outside, life kept going without him. Friends faded. Calls stopped. His girlfriend moved on. His father's health declined. His mother tried to stay strong, but grief lived in her voice. Sonny learned quickly that prison doesn't just take your freedom, it takes your sense of time. Days melt into weeks, weeks into years. You start to measure life by seasons and parole hearings that never come. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he held on to a single belief. If I keep fighting, one day the truth will come out. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But he refused to let go. Before prison, Sonny had been the kind of man who fixed things. But now, he had to fix something bigger than any machine. He had to fix his own life. He told himself, "They made a mistake. I'll show them." It was the only thing keeping him sane. Each night, when the lights went out, he'd stare at the cracks in the wall and imagine being home. Not a mansion, not luxury, just home. Sitting at his mother's table, eating her food, hearing her laugh. Freedom wasn't a fantasy for him. It was a memory. He would say later, after his release, that the hardest part wasn't just losing the outside world. It was watching himself disappear inside that place. But back then, in those early days, he didn't know yet how long the fight would be. He thought maybe a few months, a year. Maybe someone would review the evidence, see the mistake, set him free. He had no idea that it would take more than 20 years. 20 years of appeals, denials, and heartbreak. 20 years of waking up to the same walls, the same sound of steel doors. 20 years of saying, "I didn't do this," and still believing that someday, somehow, someone would finally listen. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy. The kind of air that makes you whisper without meaning to. Sonny Bharadia sat beside his lawyer, wearing a plain suit that didn't quite fit, his wrists still marked from the cuffs. He'd spent the morning staring at his reflection in a scratched mirror, trying to see what they saw. A criminal, a threat, a monster. But he couldn't find that man. He only saw himself. He'd been told to sit still, look calm, look respectful. But how do you look calm when your life is on the line? The prosecution began their story, not the truth, but their version of it. They described a man who broke into a woman's apartment late one night, armed with a knife. They spoke of courage and fear, of a victim who fought back. Then they pointed, right at Sonny, and said, "This is the man who did it." And just like that, they handed the jury a villain. They didn't have fingerprints. They didn't have DNA. They didn't have any physical evidence linking Sonny to the scene. What they had was a story, a mistaken identification, and a broken system that believed what it wanted to believe. The centerpiece of the case was the victim's testimony. She told the jury she was certain. She looked at Sonny and said she was 100% sure he was the man who had attacked her. But she had identified someone else first, Sterling Flint, in an earlier photo lineup. The jury never learned how unreliable such identifications can be, especially after a traumatic event. They never heard how suggestive police lineups can distort memory. In that second lineup, Flint's picture was removed and Sonny's was added. The detectives conducting it already believed they had their man. When the victim's eyes settled on Sonny's face, they told her, "Take your time." Subtle words, but enough to tilt the mind towards certainty. By the time she pointed to Sonny, her hesitation had hardened into confidence. And that single gesture became the foundation of the case. Then came the evidence. Police told the jury that Sonny's stolen Tahoe had been connected to the crime. They implied that the stolen property, found with Flint, somehow led back to Sonny. The details were fuzzy, contradictory, but they didn't need clarity, they needed narrative. Sonny's public defender tried to argue it made no sense. His car had been stolen before the crime. He had filed a police report. There was proof. But that fact got buried under the prosecution's insistence. He's just making excuses. Every truth he offered became twisted into guilt. The stolen car became his getaway vehicle. His calmness during questioning became a lack of remorse. His confusion became evasiveness. They weren't proving what happened. They were performing a story. And Sonny, powerless, could only watch it unfold. The DNA evidence that could have cleared him? It wasn't tested before trial. Despite the presence of physical evidence collected from the crime scene, no one insisted on modern testing. Not the investigators, not the prosecution, not even his own defense attorney. They all assumed they already had the right man. Sonny begged for it, begged for DNA testing. He said it again and again. Test the evidence. It'll prove I wasn't there. But his lawyer, overworked and underfunded, didn't press the issue. And the system, efficient in its cruelty, moved forward without it. On the stand, Sonny testified in his own defense. He spoke softly, carefully. He told the jury about his stolen car, about the night of the crime, how he'd been home, miles away, unaware of what was happening. He told them about the police lineup, how he'd never seen that woman before in his life. But innocence, in a courtroom, is not enough. When the state points at you with conviction, when a victim looks at you with fear, you stop being human in the eyes of the jury. You become a symbol, a villain. The prosecutor's closing argument was sharp, confident, practiced. He told the jury this was a case of bravery, of a woman fighting back, and of justice demanding accountability. He called Sonny a predator who thought he'd get away with it. Sonny's lawyer said little in reply. He reminded them there was no DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses. But it was too quiet, too late. The jury went out to deliberate. They came back in less than 2 hours. Guilty. Every count. In that instant, everything inside Sonny went still. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He just stared ahead, eyes unfocused, trying to process the words. Life in prison. The courtroom noise, the murmurs, the scribbling, the shuffling of feet, blurred into nothing. He could see his mother's face in the back row. She looked smaller somehow, like the air had been taken from her. He wanted to comfort her, to say something, but the bailiff was already leading him away. Behind him, the world kept turning. Ahead of him, steel bars, concrete walls, and years he couldn't yet imagine. The first night in prison felt unreal. They gave him a number, a uniform, a thin mattress. He lay awake listening to the sounds, doors clanging, footsteps echoing, someone coughing in the distance. He thought about his tools, the feel of metal and heat and work. He thought about how those same hands that used to build now couldn't even open a locked door. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And slowly, reality set in. The appeals process began. Slow, confusing, brutal. His lawyer filed motions, argued that the trial had been flawed, that key evidence hadn't been tested. But every attempt was met with the same cold answer: denied. Denial became the rhythm of his life. Every time the mail came, he'd hold his breath. Every time he saw a legal envelope, his heart would race. But inside, it was always the same. Your motion has been reviewed and denied. He learned to stop hoping too hard. Hope, in prison, could break you. Still, he couldn't let go completely. He wrote letters to lawyers, innocence organizations, journalists, anyone who might listen. Most never replied. Some sent polite rejections. And so he began teaching himself. He spent hours in the prison library, studying legal books thicker than bricks. He learned how to write motions, how to request evidence, how to file freedom of information requests. The guards sometimes mocked him. "You think you're a lawyer now?" But he didn't care. He had to believe that words on paper could open a door. He started calling himself a man with two jobs, surviving prison and proving his innocence. That became his purpose, his identity. But as the years dragged on, the toll grew heavy. There were days he felt like he was shouting into a void. Days when he'd stare at the stacks of rejection letters and wonder if the world had already decided to forget him. His mother visited when she could. Every time she left, she'd smile through tears and say, "Keep fighting, Beta. Don't let them win." And every time, he promised he wouldn't. He'd walk back to his cell afterward, the smile fading, the weight returning. He once told a cellmate, "It's not the years that break you. It's the silence, the way nobody believes you." Still, he refused to stop. In 2015, 14 years after his conviction, a letter finally came that didn't start with "denied." It was from the Georgia Innocence Project. They had received his file. They had reviewed the evidence. They believed there might be something there, something worth testing. Sonny cried for the first time in years. Not out of joy, exactly, but out of relief. Someone, finally, was listening. They began pushing for DNA testing. Modern technology had advanced far beyond what was available in 2003. They wanted to test the evidence from the crime scene, the items the victims said the attacker touched, the biological material collected that night. If it wasn't his DNA, it would prove what Sonny had said all along. But even then, even with a respected organization behind him, the system resisted. Prosecutors argued the testing wasn't necessary. They said the conviction was final. They said the jury had already decided. 20 years of his life, and they still fought to keep the truth buried. The case dragged through the courts. Hearings, filings, delays. But finally, a judge granted the motion. The evidence was sent for testing. Months passed. Sonny tried not to think about it too much. But how could he not? Every day felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a verdict that could change everything. When the results came back, even the technicians were stunned. The DNA did not match Sonny Bharadia. It matched Sterling Flint, the man the victim had identified first. The man connected to Sonny's stolen car. The man the police had dismissed too quickly. 20 years too late, the truth had finally spoken. But the story wasn't over yet. Even after that revelation, it would take more legal battles, more hearings, more motions before the court officially acknowledged what Sonny had been saying since day one. He was innocent. He had always been innocent. And soon, the world would finally know it. If prison is meant to break you, Sonny Bharadia didn't get the memo. He refused to collapse. But make no mistake, he came close. There were nights so dark, so silent, that he swore the walls were whispering to him. Nights when he lay awake staring at the faint line of moonlight on the concrete floor, asking himself if the world had already moved on. He had entered prison at 27, young, hopeful, believing that the truth would set him free. By his mid-30s, he understood the truth didn't matter to the system, not unless someone forced it to. Sonny became a man of ritual. He woke up before dawn every day. The first thing he did was write. Pages of notes, ideas, half-formed legal arguments. He didn't have a typewriter, just a dull pencil and scraps of paper. He kept his documents stacked in a small box under his bed. He called it the case. It was his life's work, letters to attorneys, requests for evidence, drafts of appeals, every rejection letter he'd ever received. Other men in prison spent their days gambling, fighting, sleeping. Sonny spent his learning. He studied case law. He memorized statutes. He read appellate decisions late into the night until his eyes burned. He said once, "I figured if I can't afford a good lawyer, I'll become my own." And so he did. But prison isn't a library. It's chaos, noise, frustration. There were times when other inmates mocked him. "You still think they're gonna let you out?" they'd say. He'd just shrug and keep reading. He learned to tune out the noise, to protect his mind the way other men protected their bodies. Every denial letter he got, and there were dozens, became fuel. He'd unfold each one slowly, read it, breathe through the anger, then file it away. He told himself, "One day I'll show them all these papers and tell them." This is how many times they told me no. Years blended together, but his fight sharpened. He started helping other inmates with their cases, writing motions, explaining legal language, drafting appeals. They began calling him Document. It wasn't about credentials. It was about respect. When someone in the unit had a legal problem, they came to Sonny. He couldn't fix everything. Most of the time, he couldn't fix anything, but he listened. Listening became his quiet rebellion. In a place designed to strip you of humanity, he gave it back to others. He used to tell new inmates, "You can't let this place decide who you are." And in saying it to them, he reminded himself too. Still, there were days he broke. Days when his mother's letters arrived smelling faintly of the outside world, her perfume, her cooking, her love, and he couldn't bear to open them. Days when the power went out and the cell went black, and he wondered if anyone out there still cared whether he lived or died. He wrote in his notebook one night, "I feel like I'm buried alive in a system that's forgotten I exist. But I'm still breathing. I'm still here." He never stopped writing after that. In 2010, a friend of a friend told him about the Georgia Innocence Project, a small nonprofit that took on cases like his. He wrote them a letter, detailed, careful, factual, explaining every inconsistency in his case. He attached copies of police reports, transcripts, and his own notes. Then he waited. Weeks, months, years. Nothing. He didn't know that innocence organizations were drowning in requests. Thousands of letters just like his. But Sonny kept writing. Every 6 months, another letter. He'd say to himself, "One day they'll open one and see my name." He was right, but it would take 5 more years. In the meantime, Sonny found other ways to survive. He began exercising every morning. Push-ups, sit-ups, laps around the yard. He said it wasn't about muscles, it was about control. "They can cage my body," he said, "but they don't own it." He also began reading philosophy. He found comfort in the Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, men who spoke of endurance and inner freedom. He liked the line, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." He'd repeat it to himself before every parole hearing, every rejection. And somehow, those words stuck. He learned to endure. There were small victories too. A sympathetic guard who slipped him extra paper for his legal drafts. A fellow inmate who taught him how to type on the shared computer terminal. A new chaplain who let him use the chapel's quiet corner as a study room. And every small act of kindness reminded him that the world wasn't entirely cruel. He kept his head down. He never joined gangs. He avoided trouble. He didn't want to risk losing his good time credits or his reputation as the quiet one who reads. Because one day, when the door finally opened, he wanted to walk out with dignity. By 2015, he'd been in prison for 14 years. He was thinner now, older. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His hands, once used for work, were now covered in calluses from writing. And then, one day, the miracle arrived. That letter from the Georgia Innocence Project. They were taking his case. He sat on his bunk for hours staring at it. He couldn't even bring himself to open it at first. He was afraid it was another polite rejection. But when he finally did, the words hit him like a rush of wind. They believed him. They said there might be untested DNA evidence. They said they wanted to help. He cried quietly, hiding his face from his cellmate. He'd learned that hope was dangerous, but that day, he let himself feel it anyway. The years that followed were filled with both hope and agony. He knew the system didn't move fast, but he didn't expect it to crawl. Requests for evidence, court filings, delays, denials. He waited months for signatures, years for hearings. Every time he thought, this is it, something would push it back. But he didn't give up. He worked hand in hand with the Innocence team, writing letters, reviewing documents, explaining details no one else knew. He became his own advocate, his own investigator. At times, he even corrected legal filings from memory. One of his attorneys later said, "He knew his case better than anyone I've ever met." Even inside, Sonny became an inspiration. Younger inmates came to him when they were on the edge, when they'd lost faith, when they were thinking of giving up. He'd tell them, "Look, I've been fighting for years. If I can keep going, so can you." He wasn't preaching. He was living proof. He wrote poetry sometimes, not for anyone, just for himself. He wrote about time, about stillness, about memory. In one of his notebooks, found later, he'd written, "Freedom isn't a place. It's a state of mind you hold on to until the world catches up." That was Sonny, patient, unbroken, quietly fierce. And then came 2022. After years of waiting, the court finally approved new DNA testing. Sonny didn't let himself get excited at first. He'd learned that in the justice system, good news had a way of turning into disappointment. But this time felt different. The Georgia Innocence Project told him they had located the evidence, still preserved, untouched. They sent it to a lab. And then, all he could do was wait. Days stretched into months. Every mail call, his heart would jump. Every time a guard called his name, he thought, this could be it. And then, one day it was. The results came back clear and undeniable. The DNA on the evidence did not belong to Sonny. It matched Sterling Flint, the man who had been connected to Sonny's stolen car. Sonny remembered sitting down slowly, his knees weak. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He just whispered, "Thank you." 20 years of his life, and the truth had been there all along. He thought of his mother, of her prayers, of her letters, of her faith in him. He thought of the nights he'd begged for a miracle and how it had finally come. But even then, even with DNA proof, freedom didn't come immediately. The state didn't rush to release him. There were motions to file, hearings to hold, prosecutors to convince. He waited through it all, calm, patient, resolute. Because by then, he'd learned that justice moves slower than any clock. He once told his lawyer, "They took 20 years from me, but they'll never take who I am." And that was true. Through all the pain, through all the rejection, Sonny Bharadia had become something larger than a man waiting for freedom. He had become the embodiment of perseverance, a reminder that truth may bend under the weight of injustice, but it does not break. It's strange how justice, when it finally comes, never feels the way you imagined. For 20 years, Sonny Bharadia had pictured the moment of truth 1,000 different ways. A letter from the governor, a guard unlocking his cell with a smile, a crowd cheering outside the courthouse. But when it began to happen, it wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, careful, full of waiting. After 2 decades of filing motions, writing letters, and surviving the silence, Sonny's case had finally reached a turning point. The DNA results were in, and they didn't lie. The crime scene evidence, the items recovered from the victim's apartment, contained biological material that belonged to someone else. The name that came back from the national database wasn't Sonny's. It was Sterling Flint's, the same man tied to Sonny's stolen car. the same man originally identified by the victim before the police changed the lineup. It was as if the past had been holding its breath for 20 years and finally exhaled. When the Georgia Innocence Project told Sonny the results, he went silent for a long time. Then he said softly, "I knew it," not with arrogance, but with the kind of quiet certainty that only a man who's been doubted for half his life can have. His lawyer, a young attorney named Katie from the Innocence Project, remembers the moment vividly. She said, "He didn't yell. He didn't even smile at first. He just sat there, staring down, tears in his eyes, and said, 'I told them. I told them I didn't do it.'" But DNA wasn't freedom, not yet. Innocence cases move slowly, even with definitive science. For Sonny, this was just the beginning of another battle, convincing the same system that had condemned him to admit it had made a mistake. The prosecutors who had once argued for his guilt weren't eager to reverse course. They said they needed to review the evidence. They said the DNA might not tell the whole story. They suggested that maybe Sonny and Flint had worked together. Sonny had seen this before, the way the system resists admitting its own failure. But this time, he wasn't alone. The Georgia Innocence Project went public. They brought attention to his case, gathered expert witnesses, and filed a motion for a new trial. The petition was clear, detailed, undeniable. It laid out every flaw: the false identification process, the lack of DNA testing before trial, the ignored evidence about the stolen Tahoe, the pattern of misconduct that led to his conviction. It was a portrait of systemic failure, and it carried Sonny's name. For months, nothing happened. The motion sat in the court system, collecting dust, just like so many before it. Sonny tried not to hope too hard. He'd been here before, on the edge of something big, only for it to collapse. But deep down, he could feel it. This time was different. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him. Then came the first real sign of movement. In early 2024, the local district attorney's office, under new leadership, reached out to the Georgia Innocence Project. They wanted to meet. They had reviewed the DNA results. They had revisited the case files. And they couldn't ignore what they saw. They invited Sonny's lawyers to a meeting. Behind closed doors, they discussed what no one had dared say out loud in 20 years. That an innocent man might have been imprisoned while the real perpetrator walked free. For Sonny's legal team, it was cautious optimism. For Sonny, it was the first crack of light after 2 decades in darkness. Back inside the prison, word spread slowly. Sonny didn't tell many people. He'd learned not to speak too soon. But the few who knew started calling him the Miracle Man. He'd smile and say, "Not yet." He didn't want a miracle. He wanted justice. Every night, he prayed the same prayer he'd whispered since 2003. Let the truth speak. By late 2024, the court finally set a date for an evidentiary hearing. For the first time in 20 years, Sonny would have a chance to stand before a judge and present proof of his innocence. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of preparation. His attorneys gathered affidavits, expert reports, and new witness statements. They tracked down old police officers, cross-referenced files, and found inconsistencies that had been buried for decades. It turned out, even back in 2001, there had been doubts. Internal memos suggesting police weren't entirely convinced about Sonny's guilt. But once the case had momentum, no one had dared to stop it. Now, that buried uncertainty was rising to the surface. The hearing took place in a Savannah courtroom, the same city where Sonny's life had been taken from him. He was brought in wearing a clean prison uniform, his hair neatly cut, his posture calm. He looked older, harder, wiser, but his eyes still carried that quiet fire. When he took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He spoke slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he's been waiting half his life to be heard. He told them about the night his car was stolen, about the moment police came to his door, about the trial, the years, the letters, the denials. He told them how he'd spent 2 decades trying to prove what should have been obvious. And when he finished, there wasn't a sound. Even the judge, a stern man known for his composure, seemed to hesitate before speaking. The prosecution offered little in response. The DNA results were unambiguous. Their own expert confirmed it. The biological evidence came from Sterling Flint, not Sonny Bharadia. There was no trace of Sonny at the crime scene. No connection beyond the coincidence of his stolen car. The illusion of guilt had collapsed completely. After the hearing, the judge said he would issue a written decision. That meant more waiting. Days turned into weeks. Every time the phone rang in the Innocence Project's office, Sonny's lawyers jumped. Every time the prison mail arrived, Sonny's pulse raced. And then, on a warm afternoon in May 2025, it finally came. The judge's ruling was clear, decisive, and long overdue. The conviction of Sonny Bharadia was vacated. His name was cleared. The state conceded he was innocent. When the news reached Sonny, he was sitting in the prison yard, eyes closed, feeling the sun on his face. A guard approached quietly and said, "Bharadia, pack your stuff." Sonny looked up. "Why?" The guard smiled faintly. "Because you're going home." For a moment, Sonny didn't move. He didn't speak. Then it hit him. Home. After 20 years, 8 months, and 14 days, he was finally going home. The release happened quietly, without cameras, without a crowd. A few lawyers, a few reporters, his mother waiting just outside the gates. When the doors opened, he stepped out slowly, blinking in the sunlight. The world looked sharper, louder, more colorful than he remembered. He took a deep breath. The air felt heavier, fuller, alive. His mother ran to him, tears streaming down her face. They hugged for a long time, neither saying a word. He said later that in that moment, everything went still. The noise, the years, the pain. All that existed was his mother's embrace and the sound of her whispering, "You're free, Beta. You're free." Reporters asked him what he wanted to do first. He said, "I just want to sit in silence and maybe go for a walk without anyone telling me when to stop." He didn't talk about revenge or lawsuits or anger. He talked about peace. He said, "For 20 years, I fought to be heard. Now I just want to listen to the world again." His lawyers held a small press conference outside the courthouse later that day. They spoke of the injustice, the flawed lineup, the ignored DNA, the broken system that had stolen 2 decades of an innocent man's life. But Sonny didn't join them. He stayed a few feet away, watching quietly. When someone asked why, he said, "They can talk about the case. I lived it." It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. That night, he ate his first home-cooked meal in 20 years. Rice and lentils, his mother's favorite dish. He said it tasted like life. He slept in a real bed, under a real blanket. No guards, no bars, no noise, just silence. For the first time in 2 decades, Sonny Bharadia closed his eyes knowing that tomorrow was his own. He told the Georgia Innocence Project, "You gave me my life back." They told him, "No, Sonny, you never stopped fighting for it." For most people, victory means applause. For Sonny Bharadia, it meant silence. The kind of silence you feel deep inside you when the fight is over, but the echoes of it still live in your bones. After 20 years behind bars, after every motion denied, every letter returned, every sleepless night spent rehearsing his truth in the dark, Sonny finally had the one thing the system swore he'd never get: his name back. But what does it mean to win after losing half your life? What does justice feel like when it arrives 20 years too late? The morning after his release, Sonny woke before sunrise. He sat by the window of his mother's small apartment, listening to the city stir awake. The faint hum of traffic, the sound of birds, the soft, almost unfamiliar quiet of freedom. For years, he'd imagined what this moment would feel like, the day he'd finally be free. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like a celebration. It felt heavy. He said later, "It's like I stepped out of prison, but prison didn't step out of me." His mother moved quietly through the kitchen, cooking breakfast, her way of filling the silence. When she placed a plate in front of him, toast, eggs, a cup of tea, Sonny just looked at it for a long time. Not because he wasn't hungry, but because it felt unreal. In prison, meals were metal trays, guards shouting, no choices. Here, he had freedom down to the smallest details. How much sugar to add, when to take a sip, when to stop. He whispered, "I forgot what it's like to have options." Later that morning, his lawyers came by. They brought paperwork, release forms, compensation applications, statements to sign. The kind of bureaucracy that never seems to end, even when justice is finally served. But they also brought something else, a framed copy of the court's exoneration order. In bold letters, it read, "The conviction of Sonny Bharadia is hereby vacated. The defendant is declared innocent." Sonny stared at it for a long time. Then he ran his fingers over the words like he was trying to make sure they were real. He didn't cry. He just said, "Took them long enough to say what I've been saying since 2003. Everyone laughed softly, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laughter people use when they're trying not to break. That afternoon, he went outside. He didn't go far, just around the block. But every step felt like a miracle. He watched people pass by, rushing, scrolling on their phones, lost in thought, and wondered if they knew how lucky they were. Freedom, he realized, is invisible when you have it. You only see it when it's gone. For weeks after his release, Sonny couldn't sleep through the night. He'd wake up at 3 a.m., expecting to hear guards walking the tier. He'd look at the clock and panic, afraid he'd be written up for being out of bed. Then he'd remember where he was. He'd lie back down and whisper to himself, "You're free now. You're home." Freedom, he discovered, wasn't a single moment. It was a slow unlearning. A few days after his release, Sonny visited the Georgia Innocence Project's office in person for the first time. The staff had seen him only through letters and video calls before. Now, here he was, a living reminder of why they do what they do. When he walked through the door, the entire team stood up. They clapped. Sonny smiled shyly and said, "You didn't have to do that." But they did. Because it wasn't just his victory, it was theirs too. They had fought the system with him. They had believed him when no one else did. And as he stood there, surrounded by people who had carried his name through 2 decades of injustice, Sonny felt something shift inside him. For the first time, he wasn't just a prisoner fighting to prove he didn't do something. He was a survivor. He spent the next few weeks learning to live again. The world had changed while he was gone. Phones were smarter. Prices were higher. Cars had screens instead of radios. The internet, which had barely been part of daily life when he was arrested, now seemed to control everything. One day, he walked into a grocery store and froze. Rows upon rows of cereal boxes, snacks, colors, noise. It was overwhelming. In prison, there had been 2 choices: eat what they gave you or go hungry. Here, there were hundreds of choices. He left without buying anything. Later, he told a friend, "Freedom is loud. I'm still learning how to listen to it." The Georgia Innocence Project helped him apply for compensation. But the state process was slow. No amount of money could return the years he'd lost, his 20s, his 30s, the chance to start a family, to build a career. When asked what he wanted now, Sonny said, "I just want to build a life that feels like mine again." He wasn't angry, at least not outwardly. He said, "If I spend the rest of my life hating what they did, then they're still taking my time. I won't give them another day." In May 2025, A small ceremony was held to mark his exoneration. It wasn't in a grand hall or on TV, just a modest event at the GIP office, with staff, friends, and other exonerees. There were speeches about perseverance, about reform, about the cost of wrongful convictions. But when it was Sonny's turn to speak, he kept it short. He stepped up to the microphone, looked around the room, and said, "I used to think freedom was something you could hold in your hand. But now I know it's something you carry inside you, even when they try to take it away." The room went silent. Some people cried. Sonny just smiled. Not the smile of a man who had won, but of one who had survived. After the event, he met a young man recently freed after 10 years for a crime he didn't commit. The man said, "I don't know how to start over." Sonny put a hand on his shoulder and said, "You don't start over. You start from where you are. The rest of your story begins right here." It was the kind of wisdom only someone who's lived it could give. The local news covered his story, a few segments here and there. The headlines read, "Georgia man exonerated after 2 decades in prison. DNA clears innocent man." But none of them captured what really happened. They didn't show the nights he cried quietly into his pillow. They didn't show the rejection letters, the lost birthdays, the faces that forgot him. They didn't show the quiet courage it takes to keep believing in your own innocence when no one else will. Freedom made the news. The fight didn't. A few months later, Sonny visited the courthouse where he'd once been sentenced. He stood outside, looking up at the same stone building that had defined his life. He said, "I used to hate this place, but now I just see it for what it is, a place where people make mistakes." He paused, then added, "Some mistakes just cost more than others." One afternoon, a reporter asked him what he thought justice meant now. He said, "Justice isn't just letting an innocent man out. It's asking why he was there in the first place." That line would go viral later. But for Sonny, it wasn't meant to be profound. It was just honest. Even now, he moves through the world quietly. He doesn't like attention. He doesn't want fame. He says, "I don't want to be the face of wrongful conviction. I just want to be the man I was before all this started." But everyone who meets him says the same thing. There's something unbreakable about him. He carries the weight of what happened not as a burden, but as proof of who he is, a man who refused to surrender his truth. At night, he sometimes walks alone, under real stars, not the painted ceiling of a cell. He listens to the sounds of the world, cars, laughter, wind. And when he closes his eyes, he feels it again, the silence of victory. Not the loud kind, the kind that comes from knowing you never gave up. He said once, quietly, "They took 20 years from me, but I never let them take me." And that, more than anything, is Sonny Bharadia's victory. Not just that he was freed, but that he stayed himself through every moment of injustice. His body was locked away, but his will, that was never caged. Freedom doesn't come with instructions. No one tells you how to live again after 20 years of surviving. For Sonny Bharadia, the day the gates opened wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new kind of fight. A fight to belong in a world that had moved on without him. The first weeks were strange. Everything was both familiar and foreign. The city looked the same. The trees, the streets, the air. But everything felt different. When he walked down the street, people passed by without looking twice. No one saw the man who had just stepped out of a living nightmare. He looked like any other person, but inside, he was still recalibrating, still learning what it meant to be free. He started keeping a small notebook. Every day, he wrote down one thing that reminded him he was no longer in prison. Day 3, a hot shower that doesn't shut off after 5 minutes. Day 7, falling asleep without hearing someone screaming down the hall. Day 12, choosing what time to eat. Day 20, feeling rain on my face for the first time in years. He said, "I spent 2 decades dreaming about freedom. Now I'm just trying to live it, one page at a time." But there were shadows too. He'd lost more than time. His father had passed away while he was still inside. Friends had disappeared. The world he came back to was one where people paid bills online, ordered food through apps, and lived their lives through screens. He laughed once and said, "When I went in, phones had buttons. Now they talk back." But the laughter always ended in silence, the kind that comes when you realize how much you missed. Sometimes, at night, he'd wake up and reach for the wall next to his bed, out of habit, counting the bricks, grounding himself in the space he'd known for so long. And then he'd stop and smile faintly. There were no bars here, no walls, just freedom, still strange, still fragile, still his. People asked if he hated the system that did this to him. He said, "Hate is heavy. I carried enough weight in prison. I don't need to carry that too." Instead, he started using his story to help others. He began speaking quietly, at law schools, at Innocence conferences, at community events, about the importance of truth, of listening, of second chances. He didn't shout. He didn't dramatize. He just told the truth, plainly and painfully. And every time he finished, there was silence. That same reverent silence that follows when people realize they've just heard something real. He told audiences, "They say the system is broken. It's not. It works exactly the way it was built. The problem is, it wasn't built for people like me to survive it." Those words stayed with people. He became a quiet advocate, not for attention, but for purpose. He said, "If my story can keep one person from being forgotten, then maybe what happened to me can mean something." But even as he began rebuilding, there were moments of grief. Birthdays missed. Nieces and nephews who grew up knowing him only as a name in their parents' stories. The years of youth that he could never get back. He said, "When you lose 20 years, you don't come home the same person. You come home with ghosts." But he also said, "I'm learning to live with them, to let them walk beside me, not lead me." The state eventually issued him compensation, a number on a check meant to measure a lifetime. He accepted it quietly, folded it once, and said, "This doesn't make it right, but maybe it helps me start again." He didn't buy luxury. He bought peace. He rented a small house, one with a porch and a tree out front. He planted flowers, the kind his mother loved. Every morning, he'd water them, sit on the steps, and drink tea. He called it his ritual of normalcy. Some days were good. Some days weren't. There were flashes of memory, guards yelling, cell doors slamming, the cold sting of concrete under his hands. But with time, those flashes softened. He said, "I used to see my cell when I closed my eyes. Now I see sunlight." He still visits the Georgia Innocence Project often, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to help new clients write letters. Letters like the ones he once wrote himself, begging for someone to believe him. When they ask him how he kept going, he always says the same thing. "I didn't fight because I knew I'd win. I fought because I refused to let them define me." Sonny Bharadia's name is now part of the growing list of exonerated men and women across America. People who lost years, decades, entire lives to wrongful convictions. But Sonny's story isn't just about injustice. It's about the power of endurance, about how truth, though buried, finds its way back to the surface, about a man who refused to give up, not because he believed in the system, but because he believed in himself. Sometimes he visits the park near his home, the one with the open field and the trees that sway in the wind. He sits there quietly, eyes closed, face tilted toward the sun. He says, "In prison, I used to dream of this, just being still under open sky. And for a moment, everything else fades. The pain, the years, the scars. Just peace." When people meet him now, they don't see a victim. They see a man rebuilt by fire, tempered, not broken. He smiles easily, speaks gently, carries himself with calm grace. But beneath that calm is steel, the kind forged in years of injustice. He says, "The system tried to take everything from me, but it didn't take my will." That's the one thing they can't lock up. If you ask Sonny what he wants people to learn from his story, he doesn't talk about anger or blame. He talks about empathy. He says, behind every conviction, there's a person, sometimes guilty, sometimes not, but always human. And once you forget that, you stop caring whether justice is real or just convenient. He dreams of starting a small foundation one day to help others coming home from wrongful convictions adjust to life outside. He calls it the Second Sunrise Project. He says, "I've had my sunrise. Now I want to help others find theirs." It's hard to put into words what 20 lost years mean. It's not just time. It's identity. It's the people you never met, the memories that never happened. But when you meet Sonny today, you don't see loss. You see resilience. You see a man who walked through darkness and carried his light out with him. He once said softly, "They said I'd die in prison, but I lived long enough to watch the truth set me free." And maybe that's the lesson here. That truth, though buried under mistakes and indifference, still has a heartbeat. And as long as there are people willing to fight for it, like Sonny did, there's hope. Hope for every name still waiting to be cleared. Hope for every cell where innocence whispers in the dark. Hope for a justice system that remembers the humanity of the people it touches. If Sonny Bharadia's story moved you, if his fight reminded you that justice is not guaranteed, but earned through relentless courage, then let this not just be something you watch. Let it be something you carry. Because right now, there are men and women sitting in cells across America, writing letters just like Sonny once did, hoping someone, somewhere, will listen. At Innocence Uncovered, that's what we do. We listen. We tell their stories. We remind the world that behind every wrongful conviction is a human life still worth believing in. So if you believe truth deserves a voice, if you believe justice should never come 20 years too late, then share this story. Leave a comment for Sonny. And subscribe to Innocence Uncovered, because next week, we're bringing you another story of a life rebuilt, of innocence rediscovered, of humanity refusing to break. This isn't just true crime. This is Innocence Uncovered, exposing injustice, uncovering truth,